The restaurant was called Lumiere, one of those places where the lighting was deliberately dim and the prices were deliberately absent from the menu. Alexander Blackwood sat at a corner table, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, while his business partner droned on about quarterly projections. He had built an empire from nothing, had signed deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, had learned to read a room the way other men read books. But tonight, he was not reading anything. Tonight, he was simply tired. Tired of the money, tired of the success, tired of the emptiness that had followed him like a shadow for 5 years. The waiter appeared with their appetizers, and Alexander looked up out of habit, scanning the room the way he always did, assessing, calculating, cataloging. His eyes moved across the dining room, past the couples leaning close over candlelight, past the businessmen laughing too loudly, and then they stopped. A woman was crossing the floor, a tray balanced on her palm, her movements careful and deliberate. She wore the uniform of the restaurant, a simple black dress, a white apron, and her hair was pulled back from her face in a way that made her neck look long and fragile. Alexander's hand tightened around his glass, and the world around him seemed to go very, very quiet. It was her. It was Eleanor. His Eleanor. The woman he had married when they were both young and foolish. The woman he had divorced when his ambition had consumed everything good in him. The woman he had not seen in 5 years. She was thinner than he remembered, her face more angular, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But it was her. He would have known her anywhere. His heart was pounding so hard, he was certain the entire restaurant could hear it, and he watched, frozen, as she moved between the tables, her tray held high, completely unaware of his presence. And then he saw it. The way she moved, the way one hand rested instinctively against her stomach as she navigated the crowded room. The way her uniform strained just slightly across her middle. The way she paused to catch her breath after climbing the stairs from the kitchen. Eleanor was pregnant. Alexander's mind went blank, then flooded with 1,000 thoughts at once. How far along was she? Who was the father? Why was she working here, in this place, when she should be home, resting, safe? His hand was shaking, and he set down his glass before he could drop it. His business partner was still talking, something about the Hong Kong deal, but Alexander heard none of it. He was watching Eleanor as she approached the table near the window, as she set down plates with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing this for a long time, as she smiled at the customers with a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. He knew that smile. He had seen it in the last months of their marriage, when she had tried so hard to hold them together and he had been too blind, too proud, too consumed by his own ambition to see what he was losing. She turned then, her tray tucked under her arm, and her eyes swept across the room. They passed over his table without stopping, moved on, then snapped back. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor's face went pale, then flushed, and her hand rose instinctively to her stomach, a gesture that did not escape Alexander's notice. He saw her draw a breath, saw her square her shoulders, saw her become the woman who had once told him she would survive him. And then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, her steps steady, her head high, refusing to run. Alexander was on his feet before he knew what he was doing. His business partner called after him, but he was already moving, weaving between tables, his eyes fixed on the door to the kitchen. He pushed through it without thinking, and found himself in a world of steam and shouting and clattering dishes. The kitchen staff looked up at the sight of a man in a $1,000 suit standing in their doorway, and then they looked away because in a restaurant like this, they had learned not to ask questions. Eleanor was at the far end, her back to him, her hands braced on a counter, her shoulders rising and falling with the effort of steadying her breathing. Eleanor. Her name came out of him like a prayer, like a plea, like a word he had been holding in his chest for 5 years and could no longer keep inside. She did not turn. Her hands tightened on the counter, and he saw her knuckles go white. "You shouldn't be back here," she said. and her voice was steady, controlled. The voice of a woman who had learned to hide everything she felt. "This is for staff only." He took a step toward her, and then another, until he was close enough to see the fine tremble in her shoulders, the way her breath caught in her throat. "Please," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Please, just look at me." For a long moment, she did not move. The kitchen swirled around them, chefs shouting orders, waiters grabbing plates, the clatter and chaos of a busy night, but they existed in a pocket of stillness. Two people who had once been everything to each other, now standing on opposite sides of a divide. Neither of them knew how to cross. And then Eleanor turned. Her face was pale, her eyes bright with tears she was fighting not to shed. And when she looked at him, Alexander felt something in his chest shatter. "How did you find me?" she asked, and her voice was smaller now, the control slipping. Alexander shook his head, his hands rising, falling, helpless at his sides. I didn't know. I was here for a business dinner. He stopped, his eyes dropping to her stomach, to the swell beneath her apron that he could not stop looking at. "How far along?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Eleanor's hand moved to cover her belly, a protective gesture that made his chest ache. 6 months, she said quietly. Almost 7. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Alexander had ever carried. He stared at her, at the child she was carrying, at the life she had built without him, and he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Shame. Raw, consuming shame. Is it... He could not finish the question. He did not need to. Eleanor met his eyes, and in hers, he saw something that made his breath stop. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady again, firm. "She's yours. And before you ask, I didn't tell you because you didn't want to be told. You made that very clear when you walked away." The words hit him like a physical blow. He remembered that day, the papers signed, his bags packed, her standing in the doorway of the apartment they had shared, her face white, her eyes dry. He had told her he needed to focus on his career, that she was holding him back, that he could not be the husband she deserved. He had told himself he was being kind, that she would be better off without him. He had not known she was pregnant. He had not known, and she had not told him. And now 5 years had passed, and she was carrying his child, and she had been working in a restaurant alone, while he had been building an empire on the ruins of their life together. He reached for her, his hand outstretched, and she flinched. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but he saw it, and it stopped him cold. "Eleanor, please," he said, and his voice was raw, broken. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know." She looked at his hand, at his face, at the man who had promised to love her forever, and then walked away when forever had become too difficult. "Does it matter?" she asked, and her voice was quiet, tired. "You left. You chose your company, your money, your pride. You chose everything except me, and I survived. I built a life. I didn't need you then, and I don't need you now." The words should have angered him. 5 years ago, they would have. He would have straightened his shoulders, tightened his shawl, told himself she was being dramatic, unreasonable, difficult. But 5 years had passed. 5 years of silence, of success that tasted like ash, of nights spent in apartments too large and too empty, of lying awake and wondering what she was doing, where she was, whether she had found someone else. 5 years of learning, slowly, painfully, that the empire he had built was not worth the price he had paid for it. "I know," he said, and his voice broke. "I know you don't need me, but I need you to know that I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." Something in Eleanor's face shifted. Not forgiveness, it was too soon for that. Too much had happened, but something softer, something that might have been the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. She looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band she still wore on her right hand, the ring he had given her a lifetime ago. "Why are you here, Alexander?" she asked, and her voice was tired, so tired. "Why now?" He shook his head, helpless. I don't know. I didn't plan this. I didn't even know you were in the city. But when I saw you standing there, I realized I have spent 5 years trying to fill a hole that only you have ever been able to fill. And I have failed. Every single day, I have failed. A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, then another. She wiped them away quickly, fiercely, as if angry at herself for crying. You can't just say things like that, she whispered. You can't just walk back into my life and expect me to... She could not finish. Her hand pressed against her stomach, and Alexander saw her face tighten, saw her breath catch, and something in him shifted from desperate to protective. You're in pain, he said, and it was not a question. She shook her head, but her hand was still pressed against her belly, and her face had gone pale. It's nothing. Just Braxton Hicks. I'm fine. Alexander moved before she could stop him, his hand finding her elbow, steadying her. She tried to pull away, but he held firm, gently, not letting go. When did you last eat? He asked, and his voice was the voice he used in boardrooms. Commanding, certain. Eleanor blinked at the change in him, confused. I had something earlier. When? She did not answer, and Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest. He looked around the kitchen, found the head chef watching them with narrowed eyes. She's done for the night, he said, and his voice brooked no argument. I'm taking her home. Eleanor protested, of course. She told him she was fine, that she had work to do, that she did not need his help. But he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled, the way she leaned slightly against his arm without meaning to. He guided her out of the kitchen, through the back hallway into the cool night air. His car was waiting at the curb, and he helped her into the passenger seat, his hands gentle, careful, as if she were made of something fragile. She did not give him her address. He did not ask. He knew it anyway, because he had known it for months, had known it and not come, had been too proud and too afraid and too certain she would not want to see him. The apartment was small, much smaller than the places she had lived when they were together, but it was clean and warm and hers. Alexander stood in the doorway, looking at the life she had built without him, the books on the shelf, the photographs on the wall, the small nursery that had been prepared with such care. There was a crib, white and simple, and a mobile of stars hanging above it. And when Eleanor saw him looking, her hand went to her stomach again, protective. I didn't want her to have nothing, she said quietly. Even if she had to have no father. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees before her. His hands found hers, and he pressed them to his lips, his shoulders shaking, his tears falling onto their joined fingers. I want to be her father, he said, and his voice was raw, broken, stripped of every pretense he had ever worn. I want to be here. I want to make up for every day I missed. I know I don't deserve it. I know I don't deserve you. But I am asking anyway. I am begging. Eleanor looked down at him, this man who had been her whole world, who had shattered her heart, who had spent 5 years learning what she had known all along, that love was worth more than any empire. She lowered herself slowly, carefully, until she was kneeling before him, her hands still in his, her face inches from his. I don't forgive you, she said, and her voice was quiet but steady. Not yet. Not today. But I am tired of being alone, Alexander. I am so tired of being alone. He pulled her into his arms, gently, carefully, mindful of the child between them, and held her against his chest. She did not pull away. She pressed her face into his shoulder, and for the first time in 5 years, she let herself cry. And in the small apartment, in the quiet of the night, a family that had been broken began slowly to heal.